I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. COVID-19 is out of control in the U.S. and many other countries, but new vaccines are on the way. How good are they? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Paul Offit is a leading vaccine expert who serves on the FDA's Advisory Committee for COVID-19 vaccines. He'll provide an insider's perspective on the potential for these vaccines to end the pandemic.
Dr. Offit describes how the mRNA vaccines work and how the FDA will analyze both benefits and risks. What side effects should people anticipate?
How soon might we expect these vaccines to become widely available?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, get the latest information on vaccines against COVID-19.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the first time anyone in the world knew about SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, was late December 2019. That's when doctors in Wuhan, China, noticed a number of patients who had become ill with a disease that acted like SARS. But a fascinating report from Italian scientists strongly suggests that the virus was already circulating in Europe months before that. This research comes from Italy's National Cancer Institute in Milan. Doctors had taken blood samples from more than 900 individuals between September 2019 and March 2020 as part of a lung cancer screening study. When they tested these samples for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies, they found a relatively high rate of positive results, 11.6%. More than half of these came from the northern Italian region of Lombardy, where COVID-19 hit especially hard last spring. The most surprising finding was that some patients had already developed antibodies to the virus by early September, indicating that they'd been exposed at least a few weeks prior to that.
Many people have been looking to Sweden as an example of an enlightened approach to the pandemic. That's because the Swedish government did not close restaurants or bars and allowed younger children to keep attending school. That was last spring and summer. Everything has changed this fall. Because of a worrisome surge in COVID-19 infections and deaths, the government is imposing new restrictions. The Prime Minister has limited public gatherings to no more than 8 people. He told his countrymen, don't go to the gym, don't go to the library, don't have dinner out, don't have parties, cancel. It's going to get worse. Sweden has fared worse than its Nordic neighbors. Norway has 1/4 as many cases per capita, and Finland has 1/10. Hospitalizations are increasing faster than most other European countries.
When people think of coronavirus hotspots around the world, they may point to India, Brazil, or Spain. These countries do have high infection and death rates, but 2 states in the U.S. are now near the top when it comes to grim death rate statistics. Data from North Dakota suggest a mortality rate of 18.2 deaths per million people. South Dakota is close behind, with 17.4 deaths per million.
Superspreader events are especially worrisome. A wedding in Millinocket, Maine last summer resulted in more than 177 infections and 8 deaths. Many of those infected didn't even attend the wedding. Now a different wedding in Washington State has emerged as another superspreader event. The wedding southwest of Spokane had 300 attendees. A week later, 17 people tested positive for COVID-19. 2 other outbreaks have been linked to this wedding. If this incident follows the same pattern as Maine, there are likely to be many more infections linked to the celebration.
There has been good news recently on the vaccine front. Both Pfizer and Moderna have reported impressive efficacy for the COVID vaccines they're developing. It will still take some time, though, before large numbers of people can be vaccinated. Some people wonder how long the vaccine might offer protection. Scientists at the La Jolla Institute of Immunology measured immune system cells and their response to the SARS-CoV-2 virus at various times after infection. The IgG responding to the coronavirus spike protein was stable for more than 6 months. T-cell memory also appears to be long-lasting. The study was posted to bioRxiv, so it has not yet been peer-reviewed. These encouraging findings are consistent with those other immunologists have been reporting.
Many people wonder how effective statins are for preventing a heart attack in healthy people with high cholesterol. Even more important, how many lives do statins save? A new meta-analysis published in JAMA Internal Medicine shows that if 100 healthy people between 50 and 75 years old take a statin for 2.5 years, there will be one less cardiovascular event among that group. The data do not show that lives will be saved. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The COVID-19 statistics are grim, both in the United States and around the world. The long-feared winter wave is here. But there is some very good news for the future. 2 vaccines have shown great promise in their clinical trials.
To learn more, we turn to Dr. Paul Offit. He's one of the country's leading vaccine experts. Dr. Offit is the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he's the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Offit is the author of several books, including his most recent, Overkill, When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Paul Offit.
Thanks for having me back.
Dr. Offit, the coronavirus is spiking across the country and around the world. Places like North and South Dakota are really being slammed. Hospitals in many states are being stretched to their limits. That's why the latest news about COVID-19 vaccines have just captured everyone's imagination. Your thoughts, please?
Well, it's certainly exciting. I mean, as a scientist, you would like to be able to see the actual data. What we're looking at right now are press releases. So it's kind of science by press release. These are the data that the pharmaceutical companies would most like you to see. I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, so we will see all the data relating to this. And there are reams of it. And then we can get a much better sense of this. But all in all, here's what I would say. If you asked any scientists in this country in January, when this virus was isolated and the sequence of the virus gene was available, whether we would have 2 large trials, one of 44,000 participants, another of 30,000 participants, that showed that these 2 vaccines were somewhere in the mid 90% effective range. I think no one would have believed it. So I think we have every reason to be happy. There's a lot more information we need moving forward, but this is certainly a reason for celebration.
Indeed, it is very good news. Tell us a little bit about the more information that we need. But first, what information do we actually have?
So these vaccines are so-called messenger RNA vaccines. And the way that it works is that you take a small gene that comes from the virus, actually. And instead of inoculating you with the virus or with part of the virus or with a weakened form of the virus, you actually inoculate the participant with this small piece of messenger RNA from the virus, which then enters your cell, the cytoplasm of the cell outside the nucleus. And then it ultimately, that piece of RNA gets translated to a protein, which is the coronavirus spike protein, the protein that emanates from the surface of the virus, the protein that's responsible for attaching the virus to cells. And then that spike protein induces your body to make antibodies. So your body makes the coronavirus spike protein. Then your body makes antibodies to the spike protein, which then prevents the virus from binding to cells, or said another way, prevents the virus from infecting cells, or said another way, protects against the virus from infecting you. So that's how it works. Right now, it looks like in one of the trials, they had about 95 participants that were sick. In the other trials, now it's about 170 patients or participants who were sick. And the vaccines look to be at about 95% effective at protecting against mild, moderate, or severe disease, depending on which vaccine you looked at, which is just remarkable. It's also true for people over 65 that the vaccine looks to be at least 90% effective. The thing that you don't know is how long it's effective, because what you're looking at now, these trials just started at the end of July. So we only have, basically a couple months worth of real information. So you know that the vaccine is effective for a couple months. Does that mean it's effective for 6 months? Does it mean it's effective for a year? We don't know. We also know it's safe in, at least so far, in, say, 20,000 people, that it doesn't have a relatively uncommon serious side effect problem. But 20,000 people isn't 20 million people. So I think we're going to know only afterwards, after this vaccine is already approved and out there, whether it does have any rare serious side effect problem. And then and only then will we know really how long immunity lasts.
Dr. Offit, the effectiveness is stunning. I mean, we've been analyzing data from the CDC with regard to influenza vaccines for many, many years. And if you get to 60%, you go, wow, that's really great. Most years it averages out to about 40%. And it doesn't always work really well in older people. 95% effectiveness? I mean, wow.
Right. Wow. It's remarkable. I mean, this vaccine really appears to be as effective as any pediatric vaccine, including the best of the pediatric vaccines. And the notion that something can work that well in people who are over 65, where the immune system is to some extent senescent, is really remarkable. You're right.
Well, I am curious. I mean, how does this effectiveness compare to the kinds of vaccines you administer to children or study?
Right. It's sort of in the range of measles vaccine or human papillomavirus vaccine or Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine or pneumococcal vaccine. It's that good. And you're right. It's sort of much better than what we see even in children for the influenza vaccine, where usually the effectiveness is around 60 or 65% in people less than 18. But in adults, or especially in older adults, like those greater than 65, the vaccine is relatively ineffective.
Now, Dr. Offit, you're on the FDA Advisory Committee. You will be looking at the data. What do we know so far about the safety of this vaccine? As I understand it, quite a few Americans are not quite ready to bare their arms for a needle stick yet because they're worried about safety.
Well, it does have some moderate side effects, such as fatigue being the big one, joint pain, muscle pain, headache. Those seems to be the big side effects. Now, they occur, at least in these two press releases, in less than 10% of recipients. So that's encouraging. But some people claim that after the second dose, especially, that they might miss a day of work. So that's something to keep in mind, primarily because of the fatigue. So that, for example, if you're going to immunize your emergency department staff, you might not want to immunize them all in the same day and stagger it so that you could make sure that people aren't missing work. But again, that's a very small price to pay for a virus that this year has already crossed the 250,000 death mark.
I'm curious about how this mRNA, this messenger RNA vaccine, compares to some of the other vaccines under development.
Good question. First of all, this is a strategy, messenger RNA, with which we have no commercial experience. There is no other mRNA vaccine. So you could have told me it was going to be 10% effective. You could have told me it would be 100% effective. I was open-minded to what we would find because we don't have any experience with any other pathogen for this kind of vaccine strategy. Similarly, the other strategies that are right around the corner, like AstraZeneca's replication defective simian adenovirus, which is just basically a virus which can't reproduce itself. That's basically a monkey strain of adenovirus. That also is just another way to introduce the gene into the cell, the gene that codes for the spike protein. In many ways, these strategies are very similar. It's just different ways to get the spike protein gene into the cell. And then Johnson & Johnson has a replication defective human adenovirus type 26. Again, we have no commercial experience with either of those two strategies for any vaccine that's ever been used in the United States before. So again, let's see. I'm not sure what to expect. I'm open-minded.
Lots of new stuff happening. And as I understand it, Pfizer is getting ready to ask the FDA for emergency use authorization. How does that differ from asking the FDA to approve its product?
Yeah, so typically what happens if you do a trial like this, and the size of these trials, Moderna's 30,000 person trial, or the 44,000 person trial of Pfizer, those are typical vaccine trials for any vaccine. I mean, the human papillomavirus vaccine was a 30,000 person trial. The vaccine we worked on at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, the rotavirus vaccine, was roughly a 70,000 baby trial. So the size of these trials is typical. Johnson & Johnson is doing a 60,000 person trial. So if that's true, then why don't we just do it the way we always do it? Why don't we just have the company submit a biological license application and then have this be a licensed product? Why do we have to do it through this special mechanism, the so-called emergency use authorization? And the reason really is because of the length of the trial. I think the FDA would not typically ever approve a vaccine that had been tested for this short of a period of time. It's too bad, though, because when people hear the term emergency use authorization, they think about hydroxychloroquine, which was approved through the same emergency use authorization mechanism, when in fact it had never been shown to work. And after it was already approved, it was clearly shown not to work, to either prevent or treat COVID-19. Or convalescent plasma, which at the time that was approved through emergency use authorization, was really heralded by the administration as a major breakthrough, when in fact there were no data to suggest that it worked. These vaccines, however, have been extensively tested to see whether they work and they were safe. So I think that's the part that people don't understand. I wish we didn't call it emergency use authorization. I wish we called it something else, like biological license, pandemic variety. That may make people feel a little better.
Dr. Offit, if the FDA advisory committee that you sit on looks at the data and goes, wow, just the way I did, it works, 95% effective, and it's as safe as any other vaccine we've ever looked at, how long would it take before that emergency use authorization is granted and then ultimately approval?
Right. So the way this is going to work is the company, and it looks like Pfizer already has done this, will submit their package for approval through emergency use authorization. The FDA then will look at those data, all those data. It's reams of data that they will look through. Now, typically, if you're getting a biological license application, that process takes 1 year. If you ask for an expedited review, it can take as short as 6 months. That's not going to be true here, obviously. So I think the FDA will probably take a couple of weeks to sort of go through these data, all hands on deck, trying to look through this massive amount of information. I mean, when we created our rotavirus vaccine, our phase 3 trial, which is a 70,000 person trial, if you took all the clinical data that were generated, each piece of paper, and stacked it one on top of the other, it would have exceeded the height of the Sears Tower. I mean, that's how massive these data are.
You're listening to Dr. Paul Offit, Director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's also the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Offit serves on the FDA's Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. His most recent book is Overkill: When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far.
After the break, we'll find out how the FDA will review the data on these new vaccines.
Dr. Offit will explain who has been included in the vaccine trials.
When we consider storage requirements, the logistics look complicated.
When will vaccines be available for regular people?
You'll also learn what side effects to expect from these vaccines.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code People's 25. To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. CocoVia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is People's10. Learn more at cocovia.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
What do you need to know about the vaccines against COVID-19? There's been a lot of misinformation. We'll do our best to set the record straight as we talk today with one of the country's leading experts in vaccinology.
Perhaps you've heard that these vaccines have challenging requirements for storage and distribution. The Pfizer vaccine requires extremely cold temperatures to remain viable. How will that affect people's ability to be vaccinated?
When the polio vaccine was announced on April 12, 1955, the whole world celebrated. Families were thrilled to be able to protect their children from a terrifying virus.
Today, there appears to be a lot less enthusiasm about the new coronavirus vaccines. Polls suggest that 40% of Americans say they'll opt out of the COVID vaccine program. Why is there so much suspicion and resistance?
To answer these questions, we are talking with Dr. Paul Offit. He's the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Offit serves on the FDA's Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. Dr. Offit is the author of several books, including his most recent, Overkill, When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far.
Dr. Offit, you were just describing how the FDA is going to be reviewing this information on these new vaccines and how quickly it goes and how much data there is. Can you tell us a bit more, please?
Sure. So the companies will submit this large reef of data information to the FDA. Then the FDA, I suspect, will take a couple weeks to look through it. Then sometime at the beginning of December, they will turn to the FDA Advisory Committee to ask whether or not we agree this vaccine or these vaccines need to be approved through an emergency use authorization. And if so, for which groups would we approve it? In other words, do we think that there's enough data to say that it can be approved for sort of all Americans, including those over 65, for those with various racial and ethnic backgrounds, for those of various genders? Do we feel that there's any limitations in terms of who we would be approving it for? After we do that, then it'll go to an advisory committee at the CDC called the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices. They will review, after we approve it, or don't, if we don't approve it, it's not an issue, but if we approve it, they will probably review the same set of data independently within 24 or 48 hours. And then they will then make a recommendation to the CDC that these vaccines should be recommended for this particular group of people. When that happens, then in theory, by the end of December, these vaccines could start rolling off the assembly lines of Warp Speed, or in the case of Pfizer, of their own assembly lines, into the arms of the American public.
Now, Dr. Offit, you mentioned that you'll be looking at whether or not this vaccine can be judged effective for all Americans, irregardless of age. You'll be looking at ethnic background. You'll be looking at gender. Have all those people been included in the trials?
Yes, that was very important, that as outlined by the NIH group that was put together by Francis Collins that really helped design these trials. You want to make sure that these trials look like America. You can't go to an African-American community or a Latinx community or people who have various medical conditions or people who are over 65 and say, that we've just tested this vaccine and we found that it's effective in healthy, young, white people, and then ask everybody else to get the vaccine. So you have to have an adequate representation to convince people, not because there's any thought that there would be any real differences between the two genders or any real differences between various racial or ethnic backgrounds, but you have to, I think, make people feel comfortable that you've at least tested them.
Now, the really big issue appears to be storage and distribution. At least that's what we hear about the Pfizer vaccine, that it's going to have to be stored at really, really cold temperatures, frozen temperatures way below what we would get in our own refrigerators. The Moderna, not quite so stringent. Can you tell us a little bit about storage, distribution, and then priority administration? We understand probably healthcare workers, high-risk patients. What about average Joes like me? When might I be able to get a shot?
Right. So the Moderna vaccine can be shipped and stored at minus 20 degrees, which is freezer temperature. Then once it's thawed, it can apparently live in the refrigerator for about 30 days, a month. Pfizer's is different. That has to be shipped and stored at minus 70 to minus 80 degrees centigrade, which is extremely cold. So you have to store that in dry ice, which is really a lot of work. Then once it's thawed out, they come in sort of 5 or 10 dose, multi-dose vials, which are concentrated. So it has a life in the refrigerator before you reconstitute it of about a day. Once you reconstitute it, you have 6 hours to give that vaccine. For a 10-dose vial, you better make sure 10 people are about to get that vaccine over the next 6 hours. So I think it's going to be a real challenge. And I think that the people sort of are looking to the federal government to tell them how to do that. I'm actually fortunate enough to be on a group with Rachel Levine, who's the Secretary of Health for our Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And that's really not the problem. I think that what Dr. Levine is expecting is that the government will tell her exactly how much vaccine they're going to be sending, how many doses, and when they're going to be sending it. And then she has already sort of worked out how she's going to set up various distribution centers, which I think is going to be a lot like testing centers, where you have a center that is specifically devoted to giving the vaccine. It could be in a hospital. It could be it may even be possibly in a pharmacy, but I think, or in a doctor's office, but I think, or a university. But I think for the most part, they're going to be devoted to that because they would have to be. The Pfizer vaccine really requires a lot of attention. What she's looking for is support from the federal government then to be able to establish those centers. And that's what's been frustrating, I think.
And what about priorities? Obviously, healthcare workers first, high-risk patients second, and everybody else, when might they get access?
Right. So essential workers first. Essential workers being considered healthcare workers, people, for example, in transportation, mass transportation, law enforcement, people who work in water purification, people who work in pharmacies, grocery stores, and then people over 65 years of age, and people who have certain high-risk medical conditions, including obesity, which arguably, is about 30% of the United States population if you consider it as being BMI greater than 30. And people with diabetes. So if you just look at that, if you just say that's your tier 1 responders, that's about 150 million people. For a 2-dose vaccine, that means 300 million doses. Right now it looks like we're going to have maybe as many as 50 million doses at the end of the year. I know that for Pfizer's vaccine, the United States has already purchased 100 million doses, which would be 50 million people. So I think it's going to be a while till we are able to immunize that first group. And then for people who don't fall into any of those categories, I can't imagine we would be able to get to them till the end of next year.
So, Dr. Offit, it sounds as though the vaccine is super good news, but it's not going to be instant. We're going to have to keep wearing our masks, keep attending whatever it is we attend on Zoom. It's not going to be time to party.
Right. I think the other thing, and this is going to be the hardest thing to convince people of, well, let's suppose the vaccine is 95% effective. Let's suppose it's 95% effective for a year or 2 years or 3 years, which would be great. That's effective against disease. That what we've studied is disease. We haven't studied the other thing, which is asymptomatic shedding. In other words, people could be protected against disease, but they may still get infected and still be contagious. There's an interest in, I was just coming off an NIH conference call today. There's an interest in doing a study on college campuses to see whether or not this vaccine prevents asymptomatic shedding. Because if it doesn't, or if still a significant percentage of people can shed the virus, be contagious, then even if you've gotten vaccinated, you need to wear a mask. to protect other people. And it's hard enough to get people to wear a mask to protect themselves. So I think it's going to be especially hard to do that. But we need to generate those data so that we can have something in hand where we can tell people why it's still important to wear a mask.
Dr. Offit, we both spent time in polio wards when we were children. Now, you didn't have polio, but that's where you were hospitalized to recover from a serious surgery. It was a traumatic experience. 1 hour of visiting time a week on Sundays through a little glass window at the end of the polio ward. I mean, those scars run deep. People were terrified. I mean, parents were just totally freaked out about polio in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
And I actually remember being part of the polio vaccine trial. I think I was about 4 or 5 at the time. My brother was 2, and I remember them lining us up for our shots in probably was a high school gymnasium somewhere in Boston.
So when the polio vaccine became available, the headlines that were announced on April 12th, 1955, they were giant headlines. Salk's vaccine works. Polio is conquered. Salk was invited to the White House where President Eisenhower said, quote, "I have no words to thank you. I am very, very happy." Well, what happened? Why aren't people jumping up and down for joy? Why isn't there...
Well, some of us are.
Well, yes, many of us are. But, parents were thrilled to have their children vaccinated as quickly as possible back then. But now, it seems like people are surprisingly, I would say, almost unimpressed. It's like, where's the enthusiasm? A lot of people are going, yeah, I'm not going to get a shot. What's gone wrong?
Well, I think we live in a more cynical, more litigious, more skeptical time. We don't have nearly the trust we did then. I mean, as you may remember, when Salk's polio vaccine was released in April of 1955, 5 companies made it. One company made it badly. Cutter Laboratories of Berkeley, California, failed to inactivate the polio virus that was in that polio vaccine. So as a consequence, 120,000 children were inadvertently inoculated with live, fully virulent, deadly polio virus. 40,000 of those children developed abortive or short-lived polio. 164 were permanently paralyzed and 10 were killed. I think it was one of the worst biological disasters, if not the worst biological disaster in this country's history. Nonetheless, people still trusted the system. They still trusted pharmaceutical companies to do the right thing. Imagine were that to happen today, something like that. So it was just a very different time. We're cynical to the point that we hurt ourselves, frankly, these days.
One of the reasons that people are much less trusting now, aside from the fact that they've had some experiences like that, is that there's an awful lot of misinformation floating around. What misinformation worries you most about these new vaccines?
I think what's going to happen is that the vaccines will get out there. They won't be 100% effective. They'll be highly effective, but there will be people who will get the vaccine who may still get this infection, still suffer moderate to severe disease, and you're going to be hearing about them. 2 is there's always going to be coincidental associations, right? My grandmother got this vaccine. 2 days later, she had a stroke. She had a heart attack. You're going to be hearing that too. So we need to make sure that we can very quickly generate the epidemiological studies to show, what side effects are coincidentally associated with the vaccine and which are causally associated. Especially when you give these vaccines to older people, these vaccines are designed to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infections. They're not designed to prevent everything else that happens in life, and other things will happen, especially in an older population. So I think that's going to be the challenge for this vaccine. And sort of heaven forbid it really does have, or any of these vaccines have a really serious side effect problem that is really attributable to the vaccine. I think that would scare people because I think most people think that they are not going to be hurt by this virus, and they would be absolutely unwilling to accept any serious adverse event.
Well, I know one of the things that you perhaps or another expert we've talked to is concerned about, and I'm sure that you and your committee at the FDA will be looking for, is the possibility that having gotten vaccinated might trigger an immune response to the infection that would make it worse.
Yeah, so the so-called vaccine-induced immune pathology fear that you get a vaccine, then when you're exposed to the natural virus, that you actually do worse than had you never gotten a vaccine, which has been true for example, there was a respiratory syncytial virus vaccine, which was made by the National Institutes of Health in the early 1960s. It never became a commercial product. Respiratory syncytial virus is a virus that causes pneumonia. Children that got that vaccine, and it was a whole inactivated vaccine, meaning take the virus, grow it up, kill it with a chemical. The children who got that vaccine did worse. They were more likely to be hospitalized, more likely to develop pneumonia, and in the case of 2 children, more likely to die than children who never got that vaccine. Similarly, there was a measles vaccine that was a commercial product. It was on the market in early 1963 briefly. And again, the people who got that vaccine, when they then encountered the natural virus, were more likely to have a problem. The dengue vaccine also has that problem. That's not anything used in the continental United States, but it is used in Puerto Rico and other countries. I don't think that's going to happen here for a number of reasons. It doesn't. The animal models for SARS-CoV-2 haven't shown that. I mean, there's no evidence in humans that happens. It doesn't happen with human coronaviruses. So I really don't think that's going to be an issue. That doesn't work.
What side effects should people be expecting, and how concerned are you about the quote-unquote typical vaccine side effects associated with COVID-19 protection?
Yeah. Just to finish on the last point about vaccine-induced immune pathology, we will be looking, though. I think what you raised was really important. I think we will be looking to make sure that doesn't happen, because you never know. This is a difficult to characterize elusive virus, and I think we need to be humble moving forward. In terms of the side effects that we know about, I mean, they're fatigue, muscle ache, headache, low-grade fever. That happens, and it's sort of like shingles vaccine. That the shingles vaccine also can have sort of a difficult safety profile. I mean, nothing permanent, but for the first day or two, you could be a little miserable. So I think that's something. I think we need to make sure people know what we know and know what we don't know. We're not going to know duration of protectiveness till afterwards, but we'll look. We're not going to know about rare side effects, but we'll look. We do know about these immediate side effects, and we need to let people know about that so they're not surprised.
Well, and compared to 250,000 deaths and what people are calling the long haul syndrome, it seems like a sore arm, maybe even a headache or a fever for a day or 2 or 3 is a relatively small price to pay for that kind of protection.
Right, and we're willing to pay that price because with shingles, that is another analogous vaccine in the sense that it's a 2-dose vaccine given to adults. But if you've ever had shingles, or anybody who has shingles, it's one of the worst pains in medicine. I mean, it is right up there with bad back pain, with corneal abrasions, with labor and delivery, kidney stones. I mean, it is one of the worst pains in medicine. So you're willing to accept that to avoid the pain of shingles.
You're listening to Dr. Paul Offit, Director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's also the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Offit serves on the FDA's Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. Dr. Offit's most recent book is Overkill: When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far.
After the break, we'll learn how Operation Warp Speed works.
What are companies doing to ensure their trials are reliable?
Some people in these big trials got placebo shots. Why is that so important?
How will these vaccines affect the pandemic?
We might be able to achieve herd immunity if enough people are vaccinated. How many will it take?
Dr. Offit gives his perspective on how the pandemic might die out if the vaccines are approved and used.
Find out what we can do to help bring the pandemic to a close.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you by Verizana Health Club. This comprehensive home testing service enables you to track crucial health markers of gut health, inflammation, metabolism, hormones, thyroid function, and many other organ systems. Regular testing can help detect health imbalances before they lead to illness. online at verizana.com. That's verizana.com/health-club. Get 50% off the first month with the discount code PEOPLE50. That's PEOPLE 50. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Today, we are discussing the new vaccines against COVID-19. Will they help us put an end to the pandemic? Some people fear that the vaccine testing program has been rushed. They've heard the name warp speed, and they worry that shortcuts may have been taken. How will we know if the vaccines are really safe?
Our guest is Dr. Paul Offit, director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's also the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a professor of pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Offit serves on the FDA's Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. His most recent book is Overkill: When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far.
Dr. Offit, the name of this program, Warp Speed, has some people nervous. They're afraid that maybe the drug companies are skipping steps. We've heard from people who say, well, what about the adjuvants, the preservatives, the other stuff that they're putting in the vaccine? So can you give us some sense of what the companies have done, even though we're calling it warp speed, to follow what would be considered the appropriate process?
Right. It's certainly an unfortunate phrase. I think when you hear phrases like warp speed, race for a vaccine, who's the finalist, who's going to be the first to cross the finish line, it makes people think that critical steps are being truncated, or worse, that safety guidelines are being ignored. That's not true. The key thing that's happened here, the reason it's been done so fast, is basically the government took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies. They said, look, we'll pay for phase 3 trials. We will take the risk out of it. Phase 3 trials cost hundreds of millions of dollars. These 2 trials by Moderna and Pfizer are very expensive trials. And then, even better, we will take the risk out of mass production. We will mass produce this vaccine, even though we don't know whether it's safe, even though we don't know whether it's effective. In the case of Pfizer, which is working outside of the Operation Warp Speed program, still the government has said, look, we will pay for X hundred millions of doses of vaccine, which also takes the risk out of it for them. So that's why it's so fast. The thing you can't skip, the one thing that cannot be skipped, is the phase 3 trial. You have to do a large prospective placebo-controlled trial, which is being done. The only difference is between this and any other pediatric vaccine is that the length of time that we're studying these vaccines in a phase 3 trial is not as long. So we don't know that efficacy lasts beyond a couple months. But again, when you're dealing in a pandemic situation, you're not going to do a 4-year trial to find that out. You're going to deal with a certain amount of uncertainty. So that's the question, I think, for the person who's thinking about getting this vaccine. Have we mitigated a critical amount of uncertainty? Have we lessened a critical amount of uncertainty? And I think that we'll see what the data look like, but I think that we're going to be able to say that we have, because especially for the safety issue, if you look at the serious side effects that have occurred with vaccines, I mean, take your pick, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an ascending paralysis following the flu vaccine, which probably occurs in maybe 1 per million doses, or polio. following the polio vaccine, which occurred in 2.4 million doses with the oral polio vaccine, or basically a disease like yellow fever that occurred with the yellow fever vaccine, which occurs maybe 1 per million doses, or the latex or allergies or gelatin allergies that are associated with some vaccines, which occurs in about roughly 1 per million doses. I mean, those all occur within 6 weeks of getting the vaccine. In the case of allergies, within minutes of getting the vaccine. So I think when we do these 2-month follow-ups after the last dose looking for safety in tens of thousands of people, that's reasonable. It doesn't rule out a rare serious adverse event, but it does, I think, mitigate a fair amount of uncertainty regarding safety. And then for efficacy, we'll know you have 2 months of efficacy. I think that means it's likely you're going to have efficacy for longer. There may be some erosion in efficacy, but I don't think it'll be massive. But again, we'll see.
Dr. Offit, you just mentioned that these trials with 40,000 and 30,000 people in them, lots of people, are placebo-controlled trials. I think probably most of our listeners know what that means, but maybe we could just review quickly why that's so important.
It's the only way you can prove whether something works. Is to show that when you give it and then you put people out there in the real world who don't know whether they've gotten the vaccine, don't know whether they've gotten placebo. The doctor doesn't know it. The people who are evaluating their symptoms don't know it. The only people that know it is the so-called Data Safety Monitoring Board, which is a group of independent researchers and academicians who are not associated with government, not associated with the industry, who then are looking at real time and who's gotten the vaccine, who hasn't, who's gotten sick, who hasn't. And then when they feel that a safety and efficacy standard have been met, which they feel now with these 2 vaccines, they'll say to the company, okay, I think you can submit it now to the FDA for approval. So that's the process that proves it. Otherwise, if you just give the vaccine and just, say to people, so do you think you avoided the disease or not? You're not going to know that because you don't have really a control group. You do need control groups to prove that. The hard thing that's going to happen here is that let's say you have a vaccine that clearly does work, that clearly is 95% effective. Can you continue to do placebo-controlled trials with the other vaccines?
Yeah, that's an ethical question that's pretty important.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what the answer is. As far as the FDA is concerned, they're just doing this through EUA, emergency use authorization, which really basically is the equivalent of saying you have permission to use an investigational product. That's what that really means. But when it goes to the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices at the CDC, and they say, look, we recommend this vaccine or these 2 vaccines for this group or the other, that's a recommendation. That arguably sets a standard of care. And so then what do you do? Now, I think what's going to end up happening is when these vaccines roll out, Moderna's vaccine or Pfizer's vaccine or both, not all places in this world are going to be able to have access to those vaccines. In fact, not all places in this country are going to have access to these vaccines. So we may be able to still do placebo-controlled trials anyway, but we'll just have to see how it plays out.
Dr. Offit, I guess the question that will be on everyone's mind once the FDA issues its emergency use authorization for both Moderna and for Pfizer is how will these vaccines, if they are as effective as we hope, how will they affect the trajectory of the pandemic? We've heard so much about herd immunity. When will we even begin to approach that?
Well, so there's actually a formula for this. It's based on 2 pieces of information. What's the contagiousness of the virus, or in this, the so-called R0, and what's the efficacy of the vaccine? So let's say it's 90% effective. If the vaccine is 90% effective and you plug that into the formula, assume that the R0 is 2, meaning that you'll infect 2 people during your day, assuming you're infected and everyone you come in contact with has never been exposed. That would work out to probably immunizing about 60% of the population. Now, that doesn't include a few important facts. One is when we hear about protective efficacy at 90%, in order to stop spread, that has to be 90% effective against any sort of contagiousness. In other words, that you 90% effective at preventing contagiousness, which means preventing asymptomatic infection. But there are other things working against the virus. The hygienic measures that we use also work against the virus. So that's not included in that. And then as painful as it is, because you never want to have to rely on this at all, is that there are increasing numbers of people in this country who've been infected, who survived, deprived, and they are to some extent immune. We paid an enormous price for that, an unnecessary price for that. I think other countries have been far better at not having to pay that price using, testing and contact tracing and hygienic measures, masking, social distancing, hand washing, and we've just been terrible at that. So a lot of people have had to pay the ultimate price for that kind of thing. I mean, when Scott Atlas says something like, that herd immunity can be induced by natural infections, first of all, that's never happened. There's never been a virus in the history of humankind that has eliminated itself by immunity induced by natural infection. It's never happened, and it's not going to happen here.
And of course, we just need to remember that the price that was paid is 250,000 Americans who are no longer with us.
Yeah, which is a ridiculous price. I mean, it's why it's not a strategy. That's not a strategy. First of all, as many as 30 to 40% of people in this country are susceptible to being killed by this virus, because there's a large number of people are obese and people with diabetes, people who are over 65. You can't, have them all stay inside while everybody else is out. First of all, it never worked. It's just, it was an ill-conceived and in many sort of like a Nietzsche-esque draconian kind of philosophy for how to do that. It's ridiculous to ask people to do that when you have other things that you can do to stop it. We're not helpless here. This virus is spread by small droplets. If you have barrier protection with a mask and social distance, you can protect it. When I round in the hospital and we see patients who have COVID-19, if you give me three choices, I can either stand 6 feet away, or if I can't stand 6 feet away, I can either wear a mask or get a vaccine that, let's say, is 80% effective. Which would I choose? Number one, stand 6 feet away. Number two, if I can't stand 6 feet away, wear a mask. And number three would be to get a vaccine, because what you want to do is you want to prevent yourself from ever getting infected. You don't want to have to rely on getting infected and then having a vaccine protect you, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Dr. Offit, if you were to look into a crystal ball and assume the 90-95% effectiveness of the two current vaccines that will soon be at the FDA are in fact approved, what would you imagine over the course of the next 6 months to a year in terms of how this pandemic would gradually begin to die out?
I think that's exactly what will happen. I think as this vaccine gets out there and more people get it, that will help. So I think as the months go by, when we get to next Thanksgiving, I think that we will have a critically lower number of cases, lower number of hospitalizations, and lower number of deaths. I think the virus will probably still be circulating, but much less so. And then the question becomes, when do we get back to our normal lives? And I think that's the answer to that question is hard. I think it's going to be at some level. At what level of disease and hospitalization and death are we willing to say, I still think I'm comfortable now going back to my normal life. Remember, every year, this year, 400,000 people were hospitalized with influenza and 20,000 people died. Last year, 700,000 people were hospitalized with influenza and 60,000 died. If we wore masks and social distance every winter, we would dramatically reduce those numbers. But we don't do that because we've sort of grandfathered flu in. There may be a time when SARS-CoV-2 at some level is also grandfathered in with what I would imagine would be a much lower level of cases and deaths.
Well, speaking of influenza, in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, they had almost no influenza this year. I assume that was largely because people were careful.
That's a great point. And we're going to see what happens here, whether that's also true. But the other possibility is it's just a very, very mild flu year, or that the viruses that are entering those countries are really not critically different from the virus strains that have circulated before. So there's a lot of already existent population immunity. I think we're going to learn a lot about that this year, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Let's suppose it's true here too, that we have a dramatically lesser flu season, that far few people are hospitalized and die. And the reason is because, as you say, we have these hygienic measures. Will that in any sense change us in the future? I would predict not at all, but I guess we'll see.
Dr. Offit, how can we maximize this amazing technological achievement, the development of these two vaccines that seem to be highly effective, so that we can quickly put an end to the pandemic? What can we do to help bring the pandemic to a close?
I think we should be good citizens, that we should care about our neighbors. And that means that we should be really good about hygienic measures, distancing, social distancing, and wearing masks. So we should care about the people that we see. It's people talk about today. I was on MSNBC and they asked me a question about the latest of these sort of home test kits to see whether you're infected. Forget it. We're not going to test our way out of this pandemic. It's too late. We could have done that at the beginning. We didn't. Assume you're infected. Assume that you're asymptomatically infected. Assume that everyone you come in contact with is asymptomatically infected, and wear a mask and social distance. That's the smartest thing we can do. And as the vaccine starts to roll out, we're going to see lesser and lesser disease as in conjunction with our using the hygienic measures. And we'll get on top of this. But I just wish we saw this for what it is, which is a shared national tragedy, that we all share in this tragedy. I mean, much the same way, just going back to polio, that's how we saw polio. I mean, really, what created the polio vaccine? The March of Dimes. That was a philanthropic organization that Americans gave money to, and the March of Dimes paid for the phase 3 trial. And the March of Dimes paid for what then essentially was Warp Speed 1, which is 5 companies made vaccine at risk, not knowing whether Salk's vaccine worked or whether it was safe. So we saw it that way then, and maybe it's because we were just coming off the shared national tragedy of World War II. But it was, if you listen to the voices from those times, there's a wonderful film called The Polio Crusade by Sarah Colt Productions, and if you listen to those voices, you just hear this sort of societal feeling, which I think we had, for example, after 9/11, where we all hugged each other and saw ourselves as having experienced a shared national tragedy. This is no different. I just think we should be better patriots, and hopefully, we'll evolve to that, because right now I don't think we're there.
And what would you like to say about the people who are still doubting that they'll get a vaccine? I don't think so. I don't need to. I'm not interested. What would you hope they would take away from our show today?
Well, I think it's reasonable to be skeptical of anything you put in your body, and including this vaccine. We still have much to know about these vaccines. We've only had a couple press releases. So let's look at all the data. And I think once we see the data, then we have to be good as sort of public health people and people who try and communicate science. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. But if this holds up, I mean, if we have something that's 95% effective and appears to be safe in tens of thousands of people, I really do think people are going to want this vaccine. I mean, it's just sort of like the Beanie Baby phenomenon. There is going to be a limited edition of this vaccine when it first goes out. And I mean, I'm glad I'm a healthcare worker who could be on the front lines of getting it, because this is a great way to protect yourself, in addition to the hygienic measures, which aren't perfect, but they're powerful. And I think we just have to let people know what we know and what we don't know, and how that a choice to get a vaccine is the safer choice. A choice not to get a vaccine is not a risk-free choice. It's a choice to take a different and arguably more serious risk.
Dr. Paul Offit, thank you so much for talking with us about this crucial and timely topic today on the People's Pharmacy.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Paul Offit, Director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's also the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and Professor of Pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Offit serves on the FDA's Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. Dr. Offit has written several books, including Bad Advice, or Why Celebrities, Politicians, and Activists Aren't Your Best Source of Health Information. His most recent work is Overkill, When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com, now with a monthly health club plan.
And by CocoVia, maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements to support cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at cocovia.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1236. That number again, 800-732-2334, on the web at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show. You could subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post it on the website on Monday.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.